Have you ever had those students who struggle in school even though you know they're bright and hardworking? You've tried all sorts of things to help. You've tried more reminders, you've gotten them different kinds of planners, positive encouragement, maybe even some consequences, and nothing seems to help. The thing is, we're not dealing with the root cause, which is our kids' executive functioning skills. The first thing you have to remember is that if our kids could do better, they would do better. So the question really becomes, how do we go about helping our kids build these crucial executive functioning skills that'll help them in the classroom and beyond? So first, let's just take a few seconds to describe what executive functioning actually is. So think of executive functioning, or EF for short, as the systems we use to organize ourselves: our time, our space, our information, and our tasks. It's kind of like our brain CEO. It doesn't necessarily do the work itself, but it helps you do all the things that you need to do in order to be able to get everything done. So things like planning, prioritizing, getting started with your work, staying focused, and adjusting when things go wrong. So how exactly does EF apply to school? So to explain how executive functioning works in the school context, I'd like to introduce you to something we call the Axiom Learning tree. So what I want you to do is to think about a student as you might think about a tree, right? The leaves in a tree can only be healthy if the rest of the tree is healthy. The roots, the trunk, the branches, things like that. In a student, the same thing is true, but it just looks a little bit different, right? For a student to be successful in the classroom context, which is kind of the equivalent of the treetop or the leaves, there are a number of things that have to happen in their brain and their body efficiently and optimally so that when they get to the classroom, they're ready to be successful. In essence, what that looks like is it starts with their ability to first gather information to give to the brain. That's mainly their eyes and their ears. Once the brain gets that information, the brain then has to process that information in some way, shape, or form, right? So that's your logic and reasoning skills, that's your working memory, that's how quickly you can process information. Once the brain has understood that information, it then gives it back to the body and says, hey, body, I need you to organize yourself, organize your space, organize your time, organize this information that I'm giving back to you, or organize your tasks so that you can take this information that I have understood and you can study for that test, you can write that paper, you can do your homework, right? And then we can talk about being successful in the classroom context. And what we have found is that well over 90% of the kids that are struggling at that treetop level, it's not because they don't have the intellectual capacity to be successful at the reading and the math or the science. It's because there's something along the way from root to branch that's tripping them up so that when they get to the classroom context, they're confused by what's being asked of them and they're not equipped to get things done. So let me give you an example of what this might look like with some of the kids that you get a chance to work with. Now, it turns out that many of the challenges that arise at the treetop level in the classroom context originate with what we call auditory processing challenges or auditory processing disorder. So in essence, what that is you're not quite getting all the sounds that people are conveying to you. So it's kind of like having a fuzzy cell phone connection all the time. So think back to the last time you had a fuzzy cell phone connection. You know how your whole body kind of leans into the phone? That's essentially what the brain is doing as well. When the brain realizes that there's an inefficiency in how it's gathering information, the brain responds by allocating more of its cognitive resources to dealing with that inefficiency, right? The consequence of that, though, is that all the other things the brain normally would have done if there wasn't an inefficiency are compromised. So my logic and reasoning skills are compromised. My working memory might be compromised. Maybe I process information slower, right? And then the knock-on effect of that is that normally when the brain gets information, it creates categories so that when it needs that information later, it can go straight to the category. It doesn't have to go through all the information in the brain to get there. But when I have an auditory inefficiency in this case, what ends up happening is the brain doesn't have time to create that science folder or that math folder or that English folder, because just as soon as it figures out what is being said, that extra click of time it would have taken to create those categories, it doesn't have, because as soon as it figures it out, the next wave of information is coming at it. So what the brain does instead is it kind of holds on to as much of the information as it can, sort of without any organizational infrastructure. It kind of piles up in the brain, right? And then the consequence of that is that my executive functioning skills are compromised, right? I can't organize my information if my information doesn't come to me in an organized way, right? So it makes it harder for me to study for that test, do my homework, write that paper, whatever I might need to do for school suddenly becomes a lot harder because I was not able to access that information when I got to the classroom context in a way that allowed me to kind of efficiently and optimally translate it into the classroom. So that's why at Axiom Learning, we've built tools that go from root to treetop that identify why a student might be struggling and crucially give you the tools that you need to address any challenges that might arise anywhere along that spectrum, including executive functioning learning programs that explicitly teach our kids the skills they need to be successful in the classroom. So let me show you what that looks like. So here's a screenshot of what you might see if you're using our platform here at Axiom Learning, something we call LEAP. So you notice that we've got a number of curricula here that are curated by age. So on the upper left, you'll notice it's 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. Here, kind of in the upper right, it's 9th grade, 10th grade, all the way to 12th. Here in the lower left, it's kindergarten, which includes pre-kindergarten all the way to 2nd grade, and then 3rd through 5th grade here on the lower right. So let me just show you what that looks like in the 6th grade context. So this is what a 6th grade curriculum looks like. So you'll notice that there are a number of modules here, and these are really curated for a successful 6th grader. So we talk about building good systems, for example, how to organize physical space. So a 6th grader would organize their backpack, a 7th grader will teach them how to organize their desk, an 8th grader will teach them how to organize their room, right? So everything is curated based on what you would expect someone of a particular age to be able to do, right? We'll talk about identifying allies in the school context. Turns out a lot of kids, when they're struggling, they don't know how to ask for help. There's an actual skill set that goes into that, right? How do I build good goals? How do I manage my time, right? How do I understand that sometimes the reason I'm struggling in school is not because I don't know the information, but I'm hungry or I'm tired or I'm emotionally taxed or something like that, right? So, all of these things are things that we take for granted as adults, perhaps, that for a lot of the kids that we get a chance to work with, and particularly the kids that are struggling, they need to be explicitly taught. So how do we know executive functioning actually works? Well, we had the good fortune of working with the Gates Foundation and Harvard to run a number of randomized controlled trials to identify the impact of executive functioning skills. Here's what we found. So let me start by giving you a bit of background on the research protocol that we had in place with the Gates Foundation and with Harvard. So the kids that we got a chance to work with were 9th graders in what I would characterize as a relatively socioeconomically distressed setting, very diverse setting. And the kids that we worked with had finished in the bottom third in their scores on standardized testing for reading and math. And so we had 2 control groups. We had a control group in the school itself and a second control group at another school down the street with identical demographics. And then, of course, we had an intervention group that got a chance to use our tools. And at the end of the year, after the protocol was completed, here's what we found. The kids that were in the intervention group saw their math scores rise 5 times faster. What I'd like you to bear in mind, though, is that, remember, at no point did we actually teach them math directly. We were just giving them the executive functioning skills they needed to be able to interact with the math and be successful with it when they saw it. Same thing with the reading skills. Their reading scores rose twice as fast, but at no point did we actually teach them reading directly. We were just giving them the skills to be able to manage that information so they knew what to do with it once they got it. We saw especially strong growth with kids for whom English is not their first language, as well as with our kids who were classified as special education, who saw 2.5 times the score growth, the kids that were not, as opposed to those that were in the control group. And normally, where we ran our research protocols, they lose 10% of their kids in 9th grade every year. The year that we were working with them, they didn't lose anybody. The dropout rate fell all the way to 0. And so the school administrators attributed that to the work that we did with them. Our view is that's something we have to do in partnership with the district and with the school. It's not something we can do on our own. But what it really does speak to is what we heard from the kids again and again over the course of the year, which is up until they got these tools, they really just didn't know how to navigate what was happening in the school context. But once they had these tools and they were starting to experience that success, they wanted to stay in school. They wanted to get to class. They wanted to continue to experience that success. I have yet to meet a student that does not want to be successful in the school context. I've met lots of students that are struggling that say they don't care as a form of emotional self-defense because they're just so tired of being told that they're failing, right? But once they get these tools and these skills and they realize they can experience that success, they want to stay engaged. And that's why you see the dropout rate start to fall. So, if there's anything else that we can do to be helpful, feel free to give us a call. If you're a school district official, if you're a school administrator, a principal or assistant principal, if you're an educator, a teacher, and or a parent, feel free to give us a call at 1-800-988-5010 or drop us a note at schools@axiomlearning.com. Someone will get back to you, if not within minutes, certainly within a day or two. And, we're happy to help. So thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your day with me. And I hope that this was helpful. Thanks so much.